Hey, how's it going? Gonna keep doing Vape Train today. Still letting some of the viewers' choice stuff steep. But we're going to talk about something near and dear to my heart. So I'm a big fan of cocktail vapes, and I say without hyperbole that Vape Train has changed the cocktail game for me. So I'm going to go over some of their booze flavors. I have their light rum, their gold rum, their brandy, their cognac, their bourbon, their scotch, their botanical gin, and their Russian vodka. I'm going to go ahead and walk through them, give some quick notes. It's going to be a good time. I know that I just did noted with ID10T, Chiba, and Emily, and that's cool. Most of this information's in there, but I figured I'd give you the chance to stare at my face for a half hour while I talked about it again. So that's awesome. Quick note before we begin. When I mix cocktail vapes, I actually like fairly aggressive booze notes. So a lot of these percentages are going to be geared more towards actually using these as the booze note in a fairly stiff cocktail. So most of these are completely linear, really. So just feel free to like adjust accordingly in terms of booze percentages. If I tell you that I tried something at 4% and you call me an alcoholic, that's fine. Just crank it down a little bit. Flavor profile should still be there. As always, disclosure time, because if you can't trust this face, who can you trust? Vape Train sent me at least some of these flavors, so shout out to Vape Train. Right off the bat here, I have Vape Train's Light Rum. I really like this, and not only do I really like what's going on here, but I also really like it because it's the missing link in a whole lot of mixes that I've been trying to do. So, when they say light rum, I don't necessarily get something that I'd associate with like a white rum. I do get a fairly mellow booze note. I think you'll see as we get into these, like these kind of bounce around in terms of like how boozy they are. I'd call this one on the lower end, but it definitely has an accurate boozy note to it. It's a little darker. There's maybe a little bit of like a caramel kind of flavor. It reminds me of like a cheap gold rum or something like that. Not like a real like a reposado where it's actually aged in barrels and it has all sorts of complexity or whatever. It just tastes a little bit sweeter and more caramel than a white rum. That booziness here, again, very accurate. I feel like with a lot of rum flavors, specifically for some reason, like flavoring companies like put this weird kind of sour fruit boozy note in here, and I don't get a lot of that with this, which is nice. It's still very, very much in the background. You can taste like a little bit of like a fermented fruit note, but generally it's just that sort of realistic, but still fairly mellow kind of rum booziness. I guess the one big issue with this flavor, and you know, we'll go for it, I'll say it like 8 different times, but it's kind of top heavy, right? So you get that boozy top note and it's excellent. And there's a little bit of body underneath on this one, but it doesn't really feel like a full vape to me. Even at higher percentages, I still taste a little bit of raw VG from the base. So we've covered that it's actually kind of boozy. It's thin. It's going to work fairly well in like sweeter cocktail applications if you want to use it by itself. If you already have like a good cola base or even like the base for something fruitier like Mai Tai, I think that you could use this by itself to kind of bring some of that boozy rum top note. The coolest thing about this, for me at least, is if you lay it on top of FA's Jamaican rum. And FA's Jamaican rum is great, but it's not particularly boozy. This actually brings in that booze and it layers really nicely. So you can actually get like a full-on, not like dark spiced rum, but like a full-on like darker rum note that goes really well in cocktails where you actually want to push that rum towards the front. The big drawback with that kind of more accurate alcohol note, if you really want to call it a drawback, this isn't really a bakery rum, right? So you don't want to use this for like a butter rum or anything that's been like cooked down substantially, because that alcohol is just going to be right up there and like hot and in your face, and that really isn't a characteristic that you'll get when you actually end up cooking rum. So it's definitely more of a cocktail rum, but for cocktail rum, I think it's fantastic. Percentage wise, like I warned you, I like my cocktails a little bit strong. I honestly didn't find anything wrong with this at like 4 or 5%. Most of the percentage on these is going to be completely dependent on how strong you want your drinks. I think that you won't blow your taste buds out if you start at 2% with this. But overall, really, really solid addition to the rum canon. Okay, that was kind of a high point. Now let's do Vape Train's Gold Rum. For as cool as I think that Vape Train's Light Rum is, I don't understand what's supposed to be going on here. So their Gold Rum, as far as I can tell, tastes more like warm Miller Genuine Draft than any rum that I've ever had. It has like this weird kind of fruity sweetness to it. It's probably less boozy than the Light Rum, but it is definitely quite a bit sweeter. It has that like that fermented fruit thing going on with a whole lot of the other rums that Light Rum mostly sidestepped. It's kind of back with a vengeance here. And the alcohol note just tastes kind of off. It doesn't taste like actual rum. Like, it just tastes like something got left out in the sun too long. It's not super pleasant. There's also something really weird and savory to this. Dave ID10T was saying, oh, it tastes like barbecue sauce. I think it just kind of tastes like skunked beer, but that's because I've already got a giant flashing can of MGD in my head. But yeah, it's oddly savory on the back end. There's some body here, but it's not particularly tasty. The alcohol note doesn't actually feel like rum at all. It's just kind of weird altogether. And with Light Rum being as good as it is, probably end up giving this one a skip. So percentage wise, Vape Train does have like a special note on their website, and I haven't seen this on too many flavors. It's like, this is very strong, use sparingly. Well, I used it sparingly. I tried it at like 0.25%, and it was still bad. It was just faint and bad. So I think for this flavor, that warning really just means, hey, this isn't very good, so you don't want to taste a whole bunch of it. If you do have it, you could add it to some things and it's going to work about as well as something like TPA's Dark Rum or Inawera's Jamaican Rum, which is not very well in my experience, but it does add just a little bit of booziness. I'd keep it low if you're going to do that, just because there's this odd, yeah, it's just odd. It's kind of sour and fruity and sweet and not at all like a rum, so I'd probably keep it at like 1% maybe and try to avoid the worst of those off notes. But yeah, seriously, just buy Vape Train's Light Rum. That one's a good. Next, I have Vape Train's Brandy. So this brandy is in fact a fine girl. Very opinionated though. No, that sounds sexist. Cut that. Again, this one is pretty good. Has a nice, accurate, sort of boozy brandy note. The actual fruit here feels like very dark, kind of grapey, raisiny sort of flavors. It definitely feels like a brandy, and actually a fairly decent one at that. I do maybe get some lighter hints of like maybe a little bit of caramel sweetness, but I can kind of chalk that up to like the fruit mix. There does seem to be just a little bit of vanilla in here, maybe a little bit of orange zest, but overall it's a very clear brandy profile. This one isn't quite as top heavy as some of the other ones, which is nice. It actually has a little bit of that fruity body to it beyond just that fairly aggressive booze note up top. Seems like, going back to flavor art, this seems like you could go ahead and slot in some FA brandy or something, which is a little bit heavier, maybe even a little bit like fruitier. It's a little sweeter. You can actually use the FA brandy as a base and then put a little percentage of this stuff on top to really sell the booze. But with the level of brandy here, it's gonna be a little bit tricky to use this anywhere but like a cocktail mix. I still think if you're going like brandied fruits or even like a fruitcake profile or something that's going to use that kind of like darker boozy fruit, I think this might be overkill unless you use it super low. Overall, I really like this stuff, but yeah, it does get intense pretty quickly. So where you want it is ultimately up to you in terms of percentage, as is everything. But I'm like clarifying that again because I don't want to be accused of trying to kill people with flavors. You'd probably be safe starting here around 1%. I'm going to guess, and kind of work up from there because again, it is a fairly aggressive alcohol note, but overall this one's really solid. Next, I have their cognac. Ups and downs here, right? So I like their brandy quite a bit. Their cognac, not so much, right? So cognac is supposed to be like an actual cask aged, fancy, like darker, sweeter, kind of more dessert forward brandy. as far as I know. Doesn't really do that for me. I don't know. Whereas the brandy is very like bright and fruity and boozy, this is just kind of thin and bitter and like strangely herbal on the back end. So with those like more aged notes that you'd expect from a cognac, I don't really get those. You know, there isn't anything that is like caramel or vanilla or anything that'd be like a really cool like aged effect. There's like a weird herbal bitterness to this. It's almost kind of camphory, you know. It doesn't really remind me of an actual cognac's booziness. And the relative strength of that boozy note actually isn't all that high here. It's just kind of thin and bitter, and I'm not quite sure where to go with this. It's just not super pleasant. I don't know. It's like some of the Inawera boozes, like it's just not a super pleasant vibe. It's bitter. It's a little strange. Since it isn't super boozy, and if you do want a little bit of bitterness along with that boozy effect, you might be able to make some like really niche, like pinkies out kind of cocktails with that. But I think you'd probably be safe starting at about 2% here, just because I don't feel like the alcohol in this one will actually, you know, like blow your taste buds out. But overall, not really my favorite. Okay, moving on to whiskeys. First, I have their bourbon. I think this one is best described as the missing part of most other bourbon flavors, which is pretty good, right? So it's boozy and it's sweet and it has some of that alcohol heat to it. Definitely feels like a bourbon. You know, it has that sort of like heavy corn sweetness to it. Not a lot of oak, you know, there's just enough to kind of sell the fact that it's a bourbon, but it's not like overwhelmingly charred or smoky or anything. There's just a little bit of oak in here. But yeah, what it does well is that sort of boozy bourbon top note, which if you had like TPS Kentucky bourbon or even Flavours bourbon, like they don't really have that going on. So this ends up being super interesting. It's probably enough bourbon if you, again, already have like a beveragey kind of base or whatever. If you wanted to add this and you already had a cola base set, you could just add this. That'd probably be fine. But if you want to build like a ground up boozy cocktail, I think a smaller percentage of this on top of another bourbon like TPA's Kentucky bourbon, maybe go wild, add some Flavours bourbon for the oak, basically rip off whatever ID10T was talking about. In terms of off notes, there's not too many. You know, I think that the booziness here, while being fairly accurate to like a lower tier bourbon, it does have a little bit of like a fermented, like fruity note to it. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't overpower the entire thing. I feel like it's in there. But yeah, in general, I mean, linear usage. So just figure out where you want to, how much booze you want in your cocktail, basically, just because it sits in the top notes like that. So I'd probably go around 3 or 4%, but I like my bourbon in my vapes fairly strong. You could probably start around 2%. Not really going to run into any trouble there, but overall, very interesting, very useful if you're into cocktail vapes at all. So next we have Vape Train Scotch whiskey. Yeah, that's pretty intense, actually. Intense, but super accurate, which is a little bit spooky. So what I get right off the bat, just really big heap of peat and smoke. It's very much a scotch. It's very different from the bourbon that we just tried. It's good though. It feels fairly accurate. I feel like maybe that peat gets a little bit earthy. I think at higher percentages, you get like almost a little bit of a moldy effect, but I also get that with actual scotch, so I don't think it really counts as an off flavor. It's just something to watch out for. Some fruit, like kind of sweetness to this, but honestly, if you've ever had like a scotch that's like aged in sherry casks or anything like that, like it feels like that kind of like residual sherry sort of like fruit note, and it doesn't feel out of place at all. It feels fairly accurate here. There is a whole lot of booze here. This is definitely the booziest of these alcohol flavors that I've tried. Very aggressive, very hot booze note that pushes around other flavors in a mix really, really easily. So I've tried mixing with this quite a bit, and I've just kept like continuously dropping percentage on it. I think this one is pretty limited to where you actually want like a big bold scotch flavor. If you just want like some like scotch fruitiness or just a little bit of an accent, you can get there with Flavor Arts whiskey. But this is a big bully, and I really wouldn't break it out unless you're looking straight at cocktails or maybe like some savory tobacco applications if you want to get all classy with it. But in general, start low. I think 1%. 1% is probably where I'd start in a mix where I want a strong Scotch note. I wouldn't really try to use this as just like a little tiny frilly accent of a Scotch. I think this is cool enough and this is realistic enough that really if you're going to use it, you should just put it right out there in people's face. And 1% is pretty much where it starts to do that. So we're going to lighten it up a little bit. Go for some Vape Train Botanical Gin. I'd call this one pleasant, which isn't necessarily something that normally springs to mind with gin concentrates, but here we are. It reminds me a lot of like a Seagram style gin, you know, something that isn't like super juniper heavy, not completely aggressive with like the botanicals here. Has a good helping of sweeter citrus flavor. I'm guessing mostly lemon, some lime. It's not really like zest heavy though. It's just more of like a sweet citrus body. If you don't want to get your face melted off by Juniper, this is actually a pretty good choice because that Juniper in like FA's gin is really, really overbearing. And this isn't super piney, actually. I think like the Juniper plays more of an accent role to everything else going on here. The botanicals themselves are fairly crisp, kind of green. This one isn't super boozy. It's definitely enough to sell the gin profile, but it's not like absolutely aggressive like the Scotch or the brandy. It's definitely enough to let you know that you're working with an alcohol concentrate though. I like the level of booze here. And because this one has a little bit more body than some of the other alcohol flavors, it actually carries it pretty well too. You don't necessarily have to stack another gin in here to actually get a gin. I feel like this actually drags enough like beverage type body with it to get you a gin by itself. I'm going to say, like, controversial opinion, it's probably not as good as Flavor Monk's Pure Gin, but it also is a hell of a lot easier to get a hold of and a hell of a lot cheaper, and I'm perfectly happy calling this my gin moving forward. It's solid. So people are always going to complain about aggressive gin flavors. I'm kind of the opinion of, like, why use gin if you don't want to taste gin? So with that in mind, I like this between like 3 and 5% for a fairly strong gin flavor. Again, it's fairly linear. If you want less gin, use less gin, or maybe just learn to like gin. That's good. But yeah, overall, this one's really solid. So last for today, I have what's quite possibly the weirdest choice for a flavor, Russian vodka. So as has been established, making a vodka concentrate seems like a weird idea, right? You're generally looking at something that most people just want completely flavorless, like a good way to get wrecked without actually having to commit to tasting alcohol. So we're already starting off on kind of weird footing. This is interesting. So it's just a boozy top note, basically, where like the rest of these flavors have varying degrees of like interesting stuff happen in the base, even if they're a little bit thin. This is just like a hot sort of neutral alcohol note. I do pick up maybe a little bit of like lemon zest or like citrus peel or something, but mostly it's just that kind of raw alcohol note. And it's a fairly rough raw alcohol note. Like if you were going to say like base it on a vodka, it definitely feels kind of bottom shelf vodka, but it's legitimately boozy, which is kind of impressive. Not much working in the base here. So mixing with this has been really interesting. It just sits on top of a mix, which is weird. So if you've ever like made yourself a screwdriver and put in too much vodka, and you know how you just get like that weird bite of cheap vodka at the top that doesn't really go away? That's kind of how this concentrate mixes. It's more of like a float of vodka than a way to actually get like an alcohol flavor down into a cocktail. But it does an admirable job of sort of conveying that booziness. And with these like big bright alcohol top notes, like I was worried that these were going to fade off after a steep, and I actually had a sample of this go out to like 3 months. It fell off a little bit, but it was still sort of there. I think in terms of like the steeping window on these concentrates, I think they do maybe fall off a little bit after about a week, but they're still very, very present up until 1 month and pretty much all the way there till 2 months. So it's not something you're really going to have a problem with in DIY mixing. Because this is just that boozy top note, the percentage here is going to be like super linear. It's going to depend on how much booze you actually want sitting on top of your mix. I feel like you start to get a bite around 2%, which is probably what you're going to be looking for if you're mixing with this. But like I said, super linear, use it at whatever percentage. It starts to get a little overwhelming and a little bit like rubbing alcohol to me, just full bore at like 5%. So yeah, probably start on the lower end of things and start cranking it up until it gets weird. But overall, it's a really interesting thing to try to make a flavor of, and it's a really interesting take on it. And if nothing else, like Vape Train just absolutely blew my socks off for finally getting like a legit boozy note. So that's awesome, Vape Train. Thank you. So hopefully my obvious affection for cocktail vapes didn't make this completely like biased and useless. But remember, for these, they're all very linear percentages. I tried to give like a starting point for them, but honestly, they're fine at whatever percentage you want to slug it in. It's just how much actual alcohol you want in there. Except for Gold Rum. That one just don't use. Still don't know what's going on with that. But overall, these were actually pretty solid and surprising. And they did things with booze flavors in vaping that I didn't think were ever going to happen. So that's really cool. So shout out to Vape Train for that. So the next video is going to be more viewers' choice stuff. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. I will catch you later. White rum. White rum. White rum. White rum.